So one of the ways that a star can exit the red giant phase is known as a nebula. So this is what a nebula looks like here. I forget what one is. I think this is Cat's Eye Nebula, but I can't be so certain. So once the material is actually heavy enough, it will compress and it will compress all of it inwards into a small area, and then it will be released due to the internal pressure with the molecules. So there are four different kinds of nebula that can arise, and a supernova, which you might have heard before, is actually a kind of nebula. So all supernova are considered nebula, but all nebulae or nebulae are considered supernova. So this is mostly the initial explosion of a star. However, the bits after are not considered a supernova. It's only the initial explosion considered a supernova. The actual full formation of this new gaseous material is called a nebula. So the four different kinds of nebula, we're going to start off with the first one, which is known as emission nebula. So these are hot clouds of gas energized by UV radiation from a nearby star, causing the atoms in the cloud to emit radiation and glow like neon lights, as you can see here. Um, they're mostly red because hydrogen is mostly red on the emission spectra, unless it's a rather large nebula. Then it can go to higher and higher colors. As we can see here, this is sort of a rendition of a very high energy nebula because you can notice the sort of the yellows and the purples and the greens, which indicate a high energy release. So an example of an emission nebula that we found is actually the whole Orion or the nebula in the Orion constellation. So the next one is called a reflection nebula. So instead of actually absorbing and being energized by UV, this actually reflects the energy back. So um, this actually causes mostly blue light to occur because the ultraviolet hits the gas around it and bounces back, whereas all other weaker ones are actually absorbed in, but it's only really the blues and the purples that are reflected backwards. So star formation is frequently associated with reflection nebulae. So actually, if these particles of dust uh, collate themselves somewhere, then it can actually form a new star unique to the one that caused the initial nebula. So the Trifid Nebula is an example of reflection nebula. I can't remember what constellation it's in because I did these slides quite a while ago. Yeah, if you want to look at where it is, a Trifid Nebula is an example of a reflection nebula that we found. The third kind of nebula is called a dark nebula, and it's essentially a large clump of dust that is so tightly packed together that it actually blocks any light from behind it. They have a similar composition to reflection nebulae, but actually differ in appearance because the light source is actually somewhere different. The light source is actually coming sort of out back from here. So if you can imagine, the initial light source is coming out that way, and everything in front of it is getting blocked. So actually, dark nebulae, or nebulae rather, they're actually found in close proximity to emission and reflection nebulae. So they sort of tend to come in like trios. As you can see, we have another one in the Orion constellation, which is near one of our example of emission nebulae. So the Horsehead Nebula in Orion is actually a well-known example of one. You might have heard of it before, because it looks like a horse's head. And any sort of emission nebulae that occur behind it, it actually gets entirely blocked because of the sort of density of the dust that's here. Now, the final kind of nebula is known as planetary nebula. So it's a gas shell formed by stars that nears the end life cycle, although it actually has nothing to do with planets because it's all stars. These nebulae are typically rotund and illuminated by the remaining star in the center. So that means that there's actually still a tiny star in the center. We'll later find out that it can be an example of a white dwarf, a neutron star, a quasar, pulsar, sort of anything. But it's essentially what's known as a dead star in the middle. So an example of a planetary nebula is actually Lyra's Rings Nebula, which I can't remember what constellation, but it's somewhere near Orion because that's where all the nebulae tend to be. A couple other nebulae that might be famous. You might have heard of the Cat's Eye Nebula in the galaxy Draco. Not a Harry Potter reference. You have the Helix Nebula in the constellation of Aquarius. And again, continuing with astrology here, we have the Lagoon Nebula, which is in the constellation of Sagittarius. And then the funniest name of all that I could actually find was Lemon Slice Nebulae, which is in the Camelopardalis constellation. Essentially, from pictures that I've seen, it's an emission nebula, as far as I can remember, that essentially has this sort of shape. Now, they didn't call it the banana. I don't know why, but they just called it lemon slice because it looks like a slice of lemon. So those are the four kinds of nebulae. You can look up what types of nebulae these are because there's only four types. But you can look up what other or what kinds of nebulae all of these are.